Hi there. I am so happy you found your way to Starlet Sinister tonight. I know you are here to escape the noise, so here is my promise. Only few short ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, silence. The rest of the video is completely ad-free so you can sleep undisturbed. I've dug deep to bring you fresh stories that you won't find anywhere else. I wanted to bring you something real. If that sounds good to you, a sub would help me a lot. Before you close your eyes, let me know one thing in the comments. What is the weather like outside your window right now? I love imagining where you all are listening from. Now, get comfortable. Let the dark in. Here is story number 1. For a moment, I thought the reflection was delayed because I was tired, but it wasn't following me the same way twice. The second time, it corrected itself too quickly. The building never really went quiet, even after everyone left. It only thinned out. The hum of the servers settled into something softer, like it had moved further away instead of stopping. Rain tapped against the long windows on the west side, not loud enough to distract, just enough to stay noticed if you let your focus slip. I had been staring at the same report for longer than I meant to. I remember thinking I just needed to finish it before going home. That was the only thing that still felt normal, for longer than I meant to. The numbers weren't difficult, just stubborn. They refused to settle into anything clear, like my eyes kept adjusting in small ways I couldn't control. I leaned back slightly, more to reset my posture than anything else, and that's when something in the far corner shifted. It wasn't movement in the usual sense, more like a difference. A thin slice of darker tone where the wall met the filing cabinet. I didn't react right away. Offices at night do that sometimes, especially with rain and reflections. Light bends off the glass, off screens, off surfaces you forget are there. I looked back down at the screen. The numbers felt off again. Not wrong, just displaced. Like I had skipped a line without realizing. I blinked, then traced them from the top, slower this time. Somewhere behind that focus, the corner stayed present in a quiet way. Like a thought you don't follow, but don't lose either. I told myself to check it properly, just to clear it. When I looked up again, the corner was exactly where I left it. Same cabinet, same wall, same dim spill of light from the overhead panel, but the edge between light and shadow felt too defined. Not sharper, just more certain than it should be. I held my gaze there a second longer. Nothing moved. Still, I didn't feel finished with it. I stood up, slow enough that the chair didn't roll back too far, and crossed the space. The carpet muted everything. Even my own steps felt distant, like they belonged to another room. Up close, the corner corrected itself. The darkness softened, blending back into something normal. I let out a breath I hadn't noticed I was holding. Probably just eye strain. Back at the desk, I picked up my phone out of habit, more than anything else. The screen lit my face in a flat, even way. A notification from the sleep tracker app sat at the top. Microactivity detected. I frowned slightly. That didn't make sense. I hadn't moved enough for it to register anything. The app usually only logged changes when I shifted position or got up. I opened it anyway. The timeline showed a small spike a few seconds earlier. Not large, just enough to mark something had changed. Orientation shift, it said. I rotated the phone in my hand, testing it. The graph responded instantly, logging the movement in real time. So whatever it caught before wasn't that. I set the phone down, screen still on. The office felt the same. Quiet, rain steady, light consistent. But I noticed something then. The reflection on my monitor didn't match the angle I was sitting at. It was close enough that you wouldn't question it at a glance. But the faint outline of the room behind me sat slightly off-center, like it belonged to a different position by a few degrees. I adjusted in my chair. The reflection corrected. I leaned back again, just slightly. It slipped, not immediately. A fraction late. I stayed still this time. The delay remained. Small, almost nothing. But once I saw it, it didn't go away. The reflection wasn't following me exactly. It was catching up. I didn't turn around. There wasn't any reason to. If something had changed behind me, I would have heard it. Chairs, air vents, anything. The building wasn't that silent. Still, my grip on the edge of the desk tightened without thinking. A small, physical adjustment. Something grounding. The phone screen dimmed beside me, then went dark. For a moment, the monitor reflection became clearer without that extra light. The room behind me looked deeper than it should have. Not darker, just extended, like the space between objects had stretched slightly. I told myself to look, just turn, check, and be done with it. But I didn't move right away, because the reflection didn't feel like it was waiting for me. It felt like it was already watching. I kept my eyes on the screen a little longer than necessary, as if the reflection might settle if I gave it time. It didn't. The delay stayed where it was, quiet and consistent, like it had always been there and I had just learned how to notice it. When I finally turned, I did it slowly. The room behind me matched what I expected. Same rows of desks, same glass partitions, same dim overhead panels humming faintly. Nothing out of place, no movement, no reason for the reflection to behave differently. I stayed like that for a moment, halfway turned, letting the scene confirm itself. Then I faced forward again. The reflection came back. Not wrong, just not the same. This time, I watched it without moving. The outline of my chair, the edge of the desk, the distant cabinet in the corner, everything held steady, but there was a thin hesitation in how it all aligned, like the image needed a second to agree with reality. I leaned forward, bringing my face closer to the screen. The reflection followed, a fraction late. That small gap did something I didn't expect. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a tightening in how I processed things. My thoughts slowed, not out of panic, but because something wasn't syncing the way it should. I reached for the mouse. The cursor moved immediately. Normal. I tapped the keyboard. Each key responded without delay. All so normal. I exhaled, shallow, controlled. Screen lag, I said under my breath, just to give it a shape. Something technical, something explainable. Still, I opened a blank window and dragged it across the screen. Smooth. No stutter, no delay. The reflection didn't match that. Not in a way you could prove. Just enough that if you looked away, you'd forget what felt wrong. I stopped moving altogether. That's when I noticed the corner again. Not directly this time. Not by looking at it. Through the reflection, it sat just at the edge of the screen's surface, where the office behind me faded into darker tones. The same place I had checked earlier. The same cabinet. The same wall. Except now, in the reflection, the darkness held its shape a little too well. I didn't turn. Instead, I shifted my eyes slightly to center it without moving my head. The difference was subtle, but enough. The edge didn't soften like it had before. It stayed defined, like it belonged to something solid rather than a change in light. I told myself it was just the screen distorting depth. Glass can do that. Reflections aren't perfect. I leaned back again, testing it. The rest of the reflection adjusted with that slight delay. The corner didn't. For a second, it stayed exactly where it was, like it wasn't part of the same room. It stayed where it was, as if it wasn't tied to my position at all. My fingers pressed lightly against the desk, just enough to feel the texture under them. Something real, something immediate. I should have turned again, checked it directly like before, but a thought settled in, quiet and firm. If I turned, it would correct. Whatever was happening seemed to smooth itself out when I looked at it straight, like the environment preferred to stay consistent under direct attention. So instead, I kept watching it indirectly. The rain outside picked up slightly, tapping faster against the glass. The sound filled the gaps in the room, making everything else feel more contained. The hum of the building slipped further into the background. The phone screen lit up again beside me. Another notification. Microactivity detected. I didn't reach for it right away. The reflection shifted slightly, just enough to draw my attention back. The corner wasn't exactly in the corner anymore. Not fully. It hadn't moved across the room. The room had shifted around it. A few inches, maybe. Hard to measure through a reflection, but enough to feel different. I swallowed, though my throat felt dry in a way that didn't match the air in the room. Still no sound. No movement I could point to, just that quiet adjustment. I picked up the phone this time. The app showed another spike, slightly larger than before. The timestamp matched the moment I had noticed the shift. It listed ambient light fluctuation alongside orientation change. I glanced at the overhead panels. They hadn't flickered. At least, not that I had seen. When I placed the phone back down, I did it carefully, keeping my eyes on the screen. The reflection waited. You don't notice things like that the first time, only when it happens again. If you've ever noticed something like that, you probably told yourself it was nothing. Not frozen, not moving, just holding. I tried something then without fully thinking it through. I leaned forward quickly. The reflection followed late, but the corner. For a split second, it didn't follow at all. It stayed where it was, separate from everything else. Then it adjusted, back into place, back into alignment, like it had corrected a mistake. I felt a slow, measured pressure build behind my ribs. Not sharp, not sudden, just present. I didn't move again, because something about that delay felt different now. Before, it had seemed like the reflection was catching up to me. Now it felt like something else was deciding when to. The rain steadied again, softer this time. And without looking directly, I knew. The corner wasn't waiting for me to check it anymore. It was learning how I did. I stopped testing it after that. Not because I understood what was happening, but because the pattern had started to feel aware of the testing itself. Each small adjustment I made, leaning, shifting, watching through the screen, seemed to close the gap a little more. Not in distance, but in response. So I stayed still. The report on the screen remained open, numbers waiting where I had left them. I tried to return to it, to let the routine take over again. Line by line, slow, controlled. But something had changed in how I was seeing things. My focus didn't settle the same way. It drifted, pulling back toward the reflection without asking. The room didn't feel as wide as it should have, not physically. Nothing had moved. But the space between objects, the desks, the partitions, the cabinet in the corner felt reduced in a way that didn't match their positions. Like the air itself had become less neutral, holding shape instead of letting it pass through. I adjusted my posture, just enough to ease the tension in my shoulders. The reflection followed, closer this time. The delay was still there, but it had shortened. What used to feel like a fraction of a second now barely registered unless I looked for it. And even then, it didn't feel like lag anymore. It felt intentional. The phone lit up again. I didn't need to read it to know what it would say. Still, I turned it slightly so the screen faced me. Microactivity detected. The graph showed another spike, larger, with a new tag beneath it. Ambient shift, unclassified. I let that sit without reacting. The app had never used that label before. It usually stayed within simple terms: movement, orientation, light change. This was different, but not in a way I could challenge. There wasn't anything to compare it to. I placed the phone back down without locking it. The screen's light added another layer to the reflection. Faint, but enough to show how surfaces overlapped. The monitor, the glass partition behind me, even the polished edge of the desk, all of them carried slight versions of the room, each one a little off from the others. I focused on the monitor again. The corner was no longer sitting at the edge. It had moved further inward, but not directly, not like something crossing a floor. It appeared repositioned, as if the boundaries of the room had shifted around it instead of it moving through space. I still didn't turn. There was no point. Every time I checked directly, the environment corrected itself. Whatever was happening preferred indirect observation. It revealed itself in reflections, in delays, in the small inconsistencies between surfaces. So, I stayed with the screen. The reflection deepened slightly. Not darker, just more defined. The cabinet in the corner held its shape, but the space beside it where the wall should have been flat seemed to carry a faint density, something that interrupted how the light settled. My breathing adjusted without me thinking about it, slower, measured, not out of panic, just to keep everything steady. I tried something different. Instead of moving myself, I moved the environment. I reached for the desk lamp and switched it on. The added light spread outward, soft at first, then settling into the room. The reflection responded immediately. Surfaces brightened, edges softened. For a moment, everything aligned. The delay disappeared. I watched closely, waiting for it to return. It didn't. The reflection matched perfectly now. Movement, position, angle, everything synced the way it should. I leaned back slightly, still aligned. A small sense of relief passed through me, quiet but noticeable. Lighting issue, I said, softer this time. It felt more convincing now, more grounded. I reached for the mouse again, scrolling through the report. The numbers settled. My focus followed them without drifting. The room felt wider again, less compressed. Then the lamp flickered, not off, just a brief dimming, enough to be noticed. The reflection shifted with it, not everything, just the corner. It returned instantly. Not from the edge this time, not from the original position. Closer, not at the cabinet, near the desk. I froze without meaning to. The reflection showed it clearly now, not as a shape, not as a figure, but as a space where the light didn't behave correctly. A vertical absence that held its place while everything else adjusted around it. The rest of the reflection stayed in sync. Only that section remained independent. My hand rested on the mouse, unmoving. Not because I chose to stay still. It just didn't feel like moving belonged to me anymore. The phone screen brightened again. Another spike. This time, the graph didn't smooth out after it peaked. It held at a slightly elevated level, like the system was still processing something ongoing. I didn't check the label. I didn't need to, because the reflection wasn't waiting between movements anymore. It had already matched me, even though I hadn't moved at all. And for the first time, the thought came in clearly, without hesitation. It wasn't catching up. It had learned how to stay aligned. I didn't reach for the lamp again. The light stayed on, steady now, as if the brief flicker had been enough to settle it. The rest of the room held its shape without effort. The desks, the glass, the long windows with rain tracing slow lines down their surface. Everything stayed where it should. Only the reflection carried the difference. I kept my eyes on the monitor, letting it frame the space behind me instead of turning to face it. That felt safer, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe because direct attention had a way of smoothing things out, and I wasn't sure I wanted that anymore. The corner, if it could still be called that, sat closer than before. Not near the cabinet now. Closer to the path between my chair and the door. It hadn't crossed the room in any visible way. There was no sense of movement, no transition from one point to another. It simply occupied a new position, as if the layout had been quietly edited while I wasn't looking. I adjusted my grip on the desk, fingers pressing lightly into the edge. The reflection responded immediately. No delay. That change alone should have been enough to settle me. Everything else was aligned now. The lag was gone. The inconsistency had resolved. But it didn't feel like a correction. It felt like a completion. The phone screen stayed lit beside me, the graph still elevated. No new spikes, just a steady line where there should have been none. I picked it up this time, slower than before. The label had updated. Continuous microactivity detected. No duration listed. No explanation. Just a quiet acknowledgement that something was ongoing. I placed the phone back down, screen facing up. The reflection remained unchanged. The space near the door held that same absence, that same quiet interruption of light. It wasn't darker than the rest of the room. It just didn't behave the same way. Light reached it, but didn't settle there. I watched it for a while, long enough that the act of watching stopped feeling like a decision. At some point, I realized something else. The reflection showed the door slightly ajar. I hadn't noticed it before. I was sure I had closed it earlier. Not out of habit, just to keep the noise from the hallway out. But in the reflection, the line of the door frame was broken, a thin gap visible where there shouldn't have been one. I didn't turn. Instead, I leaned slightly to the side, just enough to change the angle. The reflection adjusted perfectly. The door remained slightly open. A small shift of air followed. Not a breeze, just a subtle change in how the room felt. Enough to register. My breathing slowed again, not forced, just controlled. If I turned, it would correct. That had been consistent from the start. So I stayed where I was, watching. The absence near the door didn't move closer. It didn't need to. It was already positioned somewhere that mattered, between me and the exit, not blocking it, just present in that space. I reached for the mouse again, more out of habit than intent. The cursor moved. The report scrolled. Everything on the screen behaved normally. The reflection did too. Except for that one section. I leaned forward slightly. It stayed aligned. No delay. No correction. Just a steady, shared position. The rain outside softened, the tapping against the glass thinning into something barely there. The room felt more enclosed without it, like the background had been lowered. I don't remember deciding to stand. I only remember noticing that I hadn't. My body stayed still, heavier than it should have been, not pinned, just uninterested in movement. Like the idea of standing had been acknowledged and set aside without action. The phone screen dimmed, then brightened again on its own. Another update. The graph hadn't changed shape, but a new line appeared beneath it. User state, inactive. I let that sit without reacting. My hand was still on the desk. My eyes were still on the screen. My breathing was steady, measured. Inactive didn't fit, unless the system was reading something else. The reflection held. The door stayed slightly open. The absence remained in that space between, and slowly, without any clear point of transition, the need to check it directly faded. Not because it felt safe, because it felt unnecessary. Whatever difference existed between looking and not looking had already been accounted for. The room, the reflection, the small inconsistencies in how light behaved, they had settled into a single version of things. Stable, consistent, quiet. I stayed seated, eyes forward, letting the screen carry the room for me. The report remained unfinished. The numbers waited without changing. Somewhere beyond the glass, the rain stopped completely. And in the reflection, the space near the door held its place, unchanged, as if it had always been there. Not entering, not leaving, just part of how the room worked now. And after a while, I stopped checking if it was still there. At some point, I stopped trying to understand it, because it always was. Story number 2. She didn't notice it when she walked past the mirror. The mirror noticed first. It began as something too small to name. The hallway in Eleanor Voss's home had always been narrow, measured by habit rather than thought. A straight line between the front room and the kitchen where her hand could find the wall without looking. She had lived in the house long enough that movement required no attention. Even in low light, her steps aligned with memory. One evening, while passing the mirror fixed halfway down the corridor, she noticed something that didn't interrupt her stride, only lingered behind it. The reflection showed the hallway extending slightly further than it should, not dramatically, just enough that the far wall appeared softer, as though it had been placed a few inches back. She did not stop, because nothing had happened yet. At least, not where she was looking. The body often ignores what it cannot immediately classify. She reached the kitchen, turned on the tap, and stood there longer than necessary, not thinking about the hallway, but not quite forgetting it either. The house felt normal. The pipes sounded the same. The light held steady. When she walked back, the mirror showed nothing unusual. The corridor returned to its expected proportions. The far wall sat exactly where it should. There was no additional depth, no distortion. The reflection aligned perfectly with the physical space behind her. She paused this time, though only briefly. Not long enough to confirm anything. just enough to notice the absence of what she thought she had seen. Moments like this often dissolve if not examined. They rely on uncertainty to persist. Eleanor continued past the mirror and into the front room, carrying with her a quiet impression that something had not behaved correctly. It was not fear. Not yet. More like a misplacement of expectation. Over the next few days, the hallway remained unchanged. She moved through it as usual, her routine intact. Morning light filtered in from the small window near the stairs. At night, the corridor dimmed into soft shadow, predictable and still. There were no sounds out of place, no movement, no objects shifted. But something about the mirror became harder to ignore. It did not draw attention directly. Instead, it began to occupy a space in her awareness before she reached it, as if her body anticipated the moment her reflection would appear, not out of habit, but out of a subtle readiness for something to be slightly wrong again. The second occurrence was clearer. She was walking toward the front room when the reflection caught her at an angle. This time, the hallway did not stretch. It changed differently. On the right side of the reflection, where there should have been a continuous wall, there appeared the outline of a door, not fully defined, more like a vertical interruption in the surface, a faint separation in the paint where no frame existed in reality. Eleanor slowed, but did not stop immediately. Her movement adjusted first, then her attention followed. By the time she turned to face the mirror directly, the door was gone. The wall was solid. She stood there longer now. Her reflection stood with her, aligned in posture, in stillness. The hallway behind her remained ordinary. The same length, the same proportions, no additional features. She reached out and touched the wall beside the mirror. Flat, continuous, unbroken. The sensation of her hand confirmed what the reflection had denied moments earlier. Something about it didn't settle right. Not as panic, but as a quiet layering of doubt over routine. The mind attempts to reconcile two versions of the same space. One seen briefly, one confirmed physically, neither fully dismissed. Later that evening, she avoided looking directly into the mirror, not intentionally. It happened in the way her gaze passed slightly below it, or to the side, as though the act of looking required more effort than before. Her body adjusted its path subtly, creating a small deviation in behavior that she did not consciously plan. This is how influence begins. Not through force, but through preference. The hallway itself remained unchanged. At least, that's how it looked. Measured, familiar, navigable without thought. But her movement through it began to carry a slight hesitation, a fractional delay just before reaching the mirror, as if something in her expected a variation. The third occurrence introduced a pattern. It happened in the early hours, when the house was quiet in a different way. Not silent, but settled. The kind of stillness that comes from absence rather than calm. She walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, the overhead light off, relying on the faint ambient glow from the front room behind her. The mirror reflected this low light unevenly. This time, the corridor did not stretch, and no door appeared. Instead, the reflection showed her standing slightly further back than she actually was, a small difference, but enough that her steps and the reflection's position did not align perfectly. When she moved forward, the reflection corrected itself. Not immediately. There was a fraction of delay, a hesitation that did not belong to her movement. She stopped. The reflection stopped. Everything aligned again. She took a step forward. For a moment, the reflection did not follow. And for a second, it didn't feel like it was behind glass anymore. Then it adjusted, closing the gap. It didn't feel like a mistake. Just wrong. It did not blur or distort. It remained clear, structured. The geometry held, but the timing was wrong. Eleanor stood in the hallway, not reacting outwardly, but holding a stillness that suggested something had shifted beyond simple misperception. Her breathing remained steady, her posture unchanged. Only her decision-making began to alter. She turned away from the mirror before testing it further. She almost looked again, but didn't. This is often the first behavioral change. Avoidance, not as fear, but as a form of control. If the anomaly is not engaged, it cannot evolve. But the environment does not require permission to continue. As she moved into the kitchen, the sense of spatial alignment did not fully return. The room felt slightly narrower than usual, though measuring it would have revealed no difference. The counters remained where they had always been, the distance between objects unchanged. Yet her movement adjusted again. She shifted slightly to the left while walking, as if compensating for something that was not physically present. These adjustments accumulate, not enough to disrupt function, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to begin altering how space is experienced. Later, when she returned to the hallway, she paused before entering it. This pause had not existed before. It was brief, almost unnoticeable, but it marked the moment where the hallway was no longer just a passage. It had become something to approach. She stepped forward. The mirror waited in its place. The reflection appeared as expected. No extended corridor, no additional door, no delay. Everything aligned, for now. But the body had already begun to learn a new pattern. And once a space changes how you move through it, it no longer needs to change visibly to remain different. The next change did not appear in the mirror first. It appeared in her movement before she reached it. Eleanor began to notice that the hallway required slightly more attention to walk through, not in a conscious way. There were no visible obstacles, no change in lighting, no disruption in structure. But her steps no longer flowed as they had before. They adjusted, almost as if the space ahead was being anticipated incorrectly. She slowed once, halfway down the corridor, unsure why. There was nothing there. Still, her body had responded as if something required correction. Something about it had started to repeat. The environment does not need to change visibly. It only needs to alter expectation. Later that same day, she stood in the front room, looking toward the hallway without entering it. The mirror was visible from where she stood, angled just enough to reflect a portion of the corridor. From a distance, it appeared normal, but distance removes detail. When she stepped closer, something subtle shifted again. The reflection showed the hallway with a slight narrowing toward the far end, as though the walls were converging, not enough to form a point. Just enough that the proportions felt incorrect. She did not move immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the mirror while her body stayed still in the front room. The reflection held steady. The narrowing remained. Then she took one step forward. The hallway in front of her did not change, but in the mirror, the narrowing adjusted as if recalculating her position. She stepped again. The reflection corrected itself, returning the walls to their expected alignment. Not immediately. It adjusted like it was waiting for her to move first. The effect disappeared once she entered the corridor. Something about it didn't settle right. The distortion was not constant, which made it harder to trust when it would happen again. It responded, not dramatically, not in a way that suggested awareness, but in a way that aligned with her position relative to the space. She began testing it without fully acknowledging that she was doing so. Standing at different points in the front room, she observed the mirror from varying angles. Sometimes the hallway appeared longer. Sometimes the far wall seemed closer than expected. Occasionally, the right side of the reflection hinted at depth where none existed. But each time she approached directly, the distortion resolved. This is how reliability begins to erode. Not through consistent change, but through conditional behavior. The space became dependent on how it was observed. That evening, a different layer emerged. Sound. Not an addition, but an absence that behaved incorrectly. The hallway had always carried small, familiar sounds. That's how she knew when something was off, when they didn't match anymore. The slight creak of floorboards under weight, the faint echo of movement against the walls. Subtle, predictable feedback from the structure itself. Now, those sounds began to misalign. As she walked, her footsteps no longer matched the expected response of the floor. The creak came a fraction later than the pressure of her step. Not enough to be clearly separated, but enough to feel disconnected. She stopped. The sound stopped. She shifted her weight. The floor responded, but not immediately. This delay was consistent with what she had seen in the mirror earlier. A slight lag between action and environmental response. She walked again, slower this time. The delay persisted. Her movement adjusted instinctively. She began placing her steps more carefully, as if attempting to align with the response of the floor rather than her own rhythm. Something about it had started to repeat. The environment no longer follows the body. The body begins to follow the environment. That night, she remained in the front room longer than usual, not out of discomfort, but because returning to the hallway required a level of attention that had not existed before. When she finally stood to move, she paused again at the threshold. This pause had lengthened. It carried weight now, not fear, but recognition. She stepped into the corridor. The mirror reflected her immediately. Everything aligned. For now, she took another step. The reflection held. A third step, still aligned. For a moment, it seemed stable. Then, as she reached the midpoint of the hallway, something changed, not in the mirror, but in her perception of distance. The kitchen felt further away than it should have. Not visibly, just enough that reaching it felt uncertain, not visually. The doorway remained in the same place, but the effort required to reach it increased. Her steps felt slightly shorter, as though the space between her and the end of the corridor had expanded without altering its visible length. She continued walking. The distance did not correct. She couldn't tell if the hallway was changing, or if she had already changed first. Each step closed less ground than expected. The movement was correct. The space just stopped agreeing with it. She did not stop. Stopping would have required acknowledging the change directly. Instead, she adjusted. Her stride lengthened. Her pace increased slightly. Eventually, she reached the kitchen. The distance resolved immediately upon crossing the threshold. Inside the kitchen, everything felt normal again. Proportions restored. Movement aligned. This created a boundary. The anomaly belonged to the hallway, not the house. Not yet. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking back toward the corridor. From this angle, the hallway appeared unchanged. The mirror reflected a standard view. No distortion, no delay. But she did not fully trust that perspective anymore, because the distortion did not exist independently. It existed in relation to her movement. Later, when she returned, she decided without fully forming the thought to test something more directly. She walked into the hallway and stopped in front of the mirror. She raised her hand. The reflection raised its hand. Aligned. She lowered it. Aligned. She shifted her weight slightly to one side. The reflection followed. Then she stepped back. The reflection stepped back. Everything appeared correct. She waited. The reflection waited. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then, without warning, the reflection adjusted its position by a fraction, not a full movement, just enough that her reflected body appeared slightly further from the mirror than she actually was. She did not move. The reflection held this new position. Her breathing remained steady, but something in her posture changed subtle, almost imperceptible. She stepped forward. The reflection corrected instantly, aligned again. It didn't feel random anymore. The environment did not only respond to movement, it also initiated small deviations on its own. Not continuously, not predictably, but enough to suggest that alignment was no longer guaranteed. She turned away from the mirror again, this time more deliberately. As she walked toward the front room, the hallway felt different behind her, not in front, behind, as though the space she had just moved through was no longer exactly the same as the one she had entered. She did not turn to check. That choice marked another shift. The avoidance was no longer passive. It was active, and with that, the hallway completed its transition from a familiar passage into something that required strategy. By the time Eleanor began changing how she moved through the hallway, the space had already begun changing how it behaved without her. The shift was not sudden. It unfolded through small decisions: where to look, when to step, how long to pause before crossing from one room into another. These decisions were not driven by fear, but by a quiet recalibration of trust. She no longer assumed the hallway would remain consistent between entries. This altered her routine first. She started leaving lights on in adjacent rooms, not to illuminate the corridor, but to reduce the contrast between spaces. The hallway, when dim, seemed to hold more variation. With light spilling in from both ends, the differences became harder to detect or easier to ignore. But the change did not depend on darkness. One afternoon, with full daylight filtering through the front window, she stood at the entrance of the corridor and noticed something that had not presented itself before. The mirror did not reflect the light correctly. The brightness from the front room entered the hallway as expected, casting a soft gradient along the walls. But in the reflection, that gradient appeared uneven. The light seemed to thin as it moved deeper into the corridor, fading faster than it should. She stepped forward. The real hallway remained evenly lit. The reflection adjusted slowly, correcting the light distribution as she approached, but not immediately. Again, the delay. Again, the slight mismatch. She did not stop to analyze it. Instead, she moved through the space with a growing awareness that observation itself was influencing the outcome. This is where control begins to dissolve. Not because the environment becomes more aggressive, but because the rules governing it are no longer stable. Later that day, she tried something different. She walked through the hallway without looking at the mirror at all. Her gaze stayed fixed ahead, focused on the kitchen doorway. Her steps remained steady, measured by memory rather than sight. The corridor felt shorter this time, not significantly, but enough that she reached the kitchen sooner than expected. Inside, she paused. The absence of distortion created its own kind of uncertainty. If the anomaly required observation to exist, then avoiding it should restore normality. But normality now felt incomplete. She turned back toward the hallway. From the kitchen, the mirror reflected her position at the far end of the corridor. Everything aligned. For now, she took a step forward, still aligned. Another step, aligned. Then, just before reaching the midpoint, she noticed something subtle in the reflection, not in the hallway itself. Her position in the mirror appeared slightly offset from where she knew she was standing. Not delayed this time, displaced. As if the version of her in the reflection occupied a slightly different coordinate within the same space. She stopped. Her timing felt slightly out of place in her own body. The reflection stopped, but the offset remained. She shifted her weight. The reflection shifted, but the offset persisted. This introduced a new layer. The misalignment was no longer temporal. It was spatial. She stepped closer to the mirror. The displacement corrected as she approached. By the time she stood directly in front of it, everything aligned again. This reinforced the pattern. The anomaly intensified with distance. Proximity restored consistency. She remained there for a moment, looking at her reflection. There was nothing visibly wrong. No distortion in her features. No change in expression. The environment behind her appeared stable, but the memory of the offset remained. She turned away. As she moved toward the front room, the hallway felt longer again. Not visually, physically. Her steps required more effort to cover the same distance. She adjusted her pace. The distance did not correct. Halfway through, she slowed. This time, she allowed herself to stop. Standing still in the center of the corridor, she became aware of something else. The air felt slightly different, not enough to notice immediately, but enough that staying still didn't feel neutral anymore. Not colder, not warmer, just denser, as if the space resisted movement in a way that the rest of the house did not. She took a step forward. The resistance remained. Another step, still there. Then, as she crossed into the front room, it disappeared immediately. This confirmed something she had not yet fully accepted. The hallway was no longer behaving as part of the house. It was operating under its own conditions. That evening, a subtle social layer emerged, not not through direct interaction, but through implication. Her phone vibrated on the table in the front room. A message from a neighbor. She read it twice. Not because it was confusing, because it didn't match what she remembered. A brief note about hearing movement late at night. Footsteps. Not loud, not urgent, just present. Eleanor read the message twice. The timing did not match her own activity. She had been in the kitchen at the time mentioned, still within the house, still moving, but not in the hallway. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked toward the corridor. From where she sat, the mirror reflected only a portion of the space. Nothing unusual. But the message introduced a parallel explanation. A human one. Someone could be moving through the house. Unlikely, but not impossible. The doors were locked, the windows secured. Still, the idea remained. The anomaly did not need to be non-human. It only needed to be unconfirmed. Later, she tested the hallway again. This time, she walked halfway through and turned around. Not toward the mirror, toward the space she had just come from. The front room appeared normal. The doorway was where it should be, the distance unchanged. But something about the angle felt slightly off, as if the perspective had shifted just enough to alter the relationship between objects. She took a step back. The perspective corrected. Forward, slight shift. Back, correction. This created a loop, a small one, contained within a few steps, but enough to establish a pattern. Movement influenced perception. Perception influenced movement. Neither remained stable on its own. She turned toward the mirror again. From this angle, her reflection appeared aligned. She raised her hand. The reflection followed. She lowered it. Aligned. For a moment, everything held steady. Then, without any change in her movement, the reflection turned its head slightly. Not enough to be called movement, just enough to feel intentional, like it had already decided to. Not fully, just enough to suggest a deviation in attention. Eleanor did not move. The reflection returned to alignment almost immediately. The motion was brief, easy to dismiss, but it introduced a new possibility. The reflection was not only misaligned, it was capable of independent variation. She stepped back. The reflection stepped back, aligned again. She turned away. This time, her pace increased slightly as she moved toward the front room, not out of panic, but out of a growing recognition that the hallway no longer required her participation to change. And once a space begins to behave independently of observation, avoidance no longer guarantees stability. After that moment, Eleanor stopped treating the hallway as something she could test. Testing implied rules. It suggested that patterns could be confirmed, repeated, understood. But the hallway no longer offered consistency. It offered responses, quiet, shifting responses that did not fully belong to her actions. So her behavior changed again. She reduced movement through the corridor to only what was necessary. Short crossings, direct paths, no pauses at the midpoint, no standing in front of the mirror longer than required to pass it. This created a new rhythm, not avoidance, but compression. The hallway became something to move through quickly, without engagement, without observation. For a while, this seemed to hold. The distortions did not disappear, but they became less noticeable. The mirror reflected correctly when glanced at briefly. The distance between rooms felt stable if she did not measure it too carefully. The floor responded closer to her steps. It suggested that reduced interaction limited the anomaly. But reduction is not resolution. One evening, while returning from the kitchen, she made a small mistake. She slowed, only slightly, just enough that her attention lingered in the space rather than passing through it. The change followed immediately. Not in the mirror, in the structure of the hallway itself. The walls did not move, but their relationship to each other shifted in perception. The corridor felt longer behind her than ahead. The front room seemed further away, even though it remained in clear view. She continued walking. The distance increased. Her steps felt less effective again, covering less space than expected. This time she stopped, not to observe, but because continuing required effort that no longer matched the visible distance. Standing there, she became aware of something she had not noticed before. The hallway no longer felt directional. It did not feel like a path from one room to another. It felt contained, as if the space between the front room and the kitchen had folded inward, creating a segment that existed independently of both. She turned slowly. The front room was still there, unchanged, but the distance to it felt inconsistent. She took a step toward it. The distance did not close as expected. Another step, still inconsistent. This established the final stage of behavioral influence. Navigation could no longer be trusted. She adjusted instinctively. Instead of focusing on distance, she focused on movement itself, step by step, without expectation of outcome. This worked. After several steps, she reached the front room. The transition was immediate. The sense of containment disappeared. Space returned to normal proportions. But the experience remained. Later that night, she received another message. The same neighbor. A short follow-up, asking if she had been moving furniture. Dragging sounds. Slow, uneven. Eleanor read the message and placed the phone down without replying. There had been no such sounds. At least, none she had heard. But the hallway had begun to interfere with sound before. Delay. Misalignment. It was possible that something had occurred without reaching her fully, or that something had occurred elsewhere and was being perceived incorrectly. Both remained plausible. She did not investigate. Instead, she sat in the front room, looking toward the corridor without entering it. The mirror reflected a stable image. The hallway appeared normal, but normality had become conditional. After some time, she stood, not out of necessity, but because remaining still in one room no longer felt complete. She approached the hallway slowly. No pause at the threshold this time. She stepped in. The mirror reflected her immediately. Aligned. She took another step. Aligned. A third. Aligned. For a moment it seemed unchanged. Then, as she reached the midpoint, something subtle occurred. Not in the mirror. Not in the distance. In her position within the space, she became aware that she could not determine exactly where she was in the hallway. Not visually, not physically. The front room felt both near and distant. The kitchen felt both ahead and uncertain. The space between them no longer resolved into a clear path. She stood still. The mirror reflected her standing, aligned. But the sense of location remained unstable. She took a step forward. The space did not confirm the movement. Another step. Still no clear progression. She turned slightly toward the mirror. Her reflection looked back. For a moment, everything appeared correct. Then she noticed something small. The version of the hallway behind her in the reflection did not match the direction she had just come from. The angle was slightly different. The depth, inconsistent. Not dramatically. Just enough that the layout felt unfamiliar. As if the reflection belonged to a version of the hallway that had shifted independently of her movement. She did not move closer. She did not test it. Instead, she remained where she was, still, breathing steady, allowing the space to exist without attempting to resolve it. After a few seconds, something changed again. Not in structure, in certainty. The need to understand where she was began to fade, not replaced by clarity, but by acceptance of inconsistency. She took another step. The front room appeared, closer than expected. She crossed into it. The hallway returned to its normal proportions behind her. From this side, it looked unchanged. The mirror reflected a stable corridor. No distortion, no delay, no displacement. She stood there for a long moment, looking at it, not searching for differences, not expecting change. Just observing, because the final shift had already occurred. The hallway no longer needed to distort visibly, because understanding meant stepping into it again. It no longer needed to delay reflections or alter distance. It had already changed how she moved, how she judged space, how she decided where she was. And once a space can influence behavior without revealing how, it does not need to become anything else. It only needs to remain. And she wasn't completely sure it was staying in the hallway anymore. Story number 3. You ever notice how some places stay open longer than they should? Even when every access point has already been checked? Even when nothing is supposed to be inside anymore? Even when no one seems to be there anymore? Marcus Bellamy asked himself that without meaning to. It came as a passing thought while he stood near the glass entrance of the transit terminal, watching the rain gather in slow sheets against the overhead lights. Halifax had that kind of rain, steady, patient, almost deliberate in how it settled into the night. It made everything feel quieter than it actually was. He checked the side access door again before stepping back. It wasn't part of his job to check it twice. Once was enough. The latch had clicked into place the first time, clean and certain, but something about the sound didn't sit right in his head. Not wrong, just unfinished. So he pulled it open again, then shut it carefully. This time he stayed there a second longer than needed. The lock held. Still he waited. Rain tapped across the roof above him, spreading into a soft, even pattern that blended with the low hum of fluorescent lights. The terminal had already emptied out. Last bus gone. Cleaning crew had passed through. What remained was that in-between state where a public place stopped feeling public, but hadn't quite become empty yet. Marcus stepped away from the door and continued down the corridor. His footsteps echoed lightly, then disappeared under the rainfall overhead. There was a section near the center of the building where the ceiling dipped slightly lower. Not enough to notice during the day, but at night it felt closer than it should, like the space had settled over time. He passed under it. Something shifted above him. Not enough to explain. Just enough to make him wonder if it had been there before he arrived. He couldn't tell if it had just started, or if he had only just noticed it. It wasn't loud, not even clear. Just a small adjustment in sound, like pressure redistributing across wood or metal, the kind of thing buildings did all the time. Marcus didn't stop, but he did slow down. The rain grew heavier for a moment, then softened again, as if it were adjusting itself. The pattern changed, just slightly, enough that the silence beneath it felt deeper. He kept walking. At the far end of the corridor, there was another access panel. Maintenance use only. It led to the upper crawl space that ran above most of the terminal. Not a full attic, just enough room for wiring, ducts, and the occasional inspection. He glanced at it as he passed. Closed. Flush with the wall. Exactly where it should be. He moved on. There was no reason to think about it again. The office sat behind a narrow glass partition near the main waiting area. From there, Marcus could see most of the terminal without needing to move much. It was part of why he preferred night shifts. Everything stayed still long enough to understand it. He sat down and set his keys on the desk. They made a small, sharp sound that faded quickly. For a while, nothing happened. Rain continued its steady rhythm above. The lights flickered once, then settled. Somewhere deeper in the building, a faint mechanical hum adjusted itself, then went quiet again. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair. Routine. That's what made this job manageable. Same checks, same order, same sounds. Even the rain felt like part of it. He reached for the monitor, pulling up the internal camera feed. Most angles showed empty hallways. Rows of seating untouched. Reflections stretching longer than usual under the overhead lights. He clicked through them slowly. Nothing out of place. Until he paused on one frame. Corridor B. The one with the lower ceiling. Something about the image felt misaligned. Not visibly wrong. Everything was where it should be. The walls, the lights, the floor markings. But the shadow near the ceiling line looked thicker than before. Marcus leaned forward slightly. It could have been the lighting, or the rain shifting again. He watched for a few seconds. The shadow didn't move. Or maybe it had already moved earlier, before he started watching. He switched cameras, then switched back. It looked the same. He exhaled quietly and leaned back again. Buildings changed at night. Shadows stretched. Angles shifted. Nothing unusual about that. Still, He made a note to check that section again before the end of his shift. Just to be sure, time didn't move in clear steps anymore. It stretched through small actions. A glance at the clock, a quiet shift in posture, the sound of rain growing heavier, then easing again. Marcus stood up after a while and stepped back into the main corridor. The air felt slightly cooler now, not enough to matter, just noticeable. He walked toward corridor B. Each step landed softer than before, or maybe the sound was being absorbed differently. The rain above had thickened again, pressing into the roof with a more consistent weight. It filled the space so completely that smaller sounds disappeared into it, almost completely. As Marcus passed under the lowered ceiling again, he heard it, a faint, uneven movement. Not a creak this time, something lighter, like a shift in position, directly above him. He stopped. The sound stopped too. For a second, everything aligned perfectly. Rain, silence, stillness. Then, the rain softened, and in that brief gap, there was a second sound, not movement, plasmo, as if something above had just adjusted where it was. Marcus didn't look up immediately. He stayed still, listening. Nothing followed. The rain returned to its steady pattern. He stepped forward again, slowly. The rest of the corridor remained unchanged, but the space above it didn't feel empty anymore. The space above wasn't empty. At the far end, the maintenance panel caught his attention again. It looked almost the same, closed, flat, but not sealed. Marcus moved closer. He didn't touch it yet, just stood there, watching. There was no visible gap, no shift in alignment. And yet, something about the edges felt loose, like it had been handled. Recently, he reached out and pressed lightly against it. It didn't open. It held in place. But the pressure returned differently than expected. Not firm, not hollow, something in between. Marcus let his hand drop. Behind him, the rain shifted again. He turned slightly, listened. Nothing else. When he looked back, the panel hadn't moved. Nothing looked different. Still, he stepped back, just enough to see it fully. And for a moment, he had the distinct feeling that whatever space sat above that panel was not following the same stillness as the rest of the building. The thought passed, but not completely. Marcus didn't return to the office right away. He stayed near the panel longer than he needed to, not out of fear, but because something about leaving it unchecked felt incomplete. The building had a rhythm, and that panel, whatever sat behind it, had slipped slightly out of sync with everything else. He stepped back into the corridor and listened again. Rain filled the space above, but now it didn't feel like a blanket. It felt selective. Certain sounds passed through, others didn't. He started walking, this time slower, each step measured without thinking. Halfway back, he stopped again. Not because he heard something, but because he didn't. The absence landed first. The rain had softened, but the usual settling noises, the quiet ticks, the faint structural shifts weren't there. It felt like the building had paused, something it normally allowed. Marcus turned slightly, looked back toward the lowered ceiling. Nothing moved. Still, the space above it held a kind of weight. Not physical, just present. He continued forward. Inside the office, the monitors flickered once as he sat down again. He didn't touch them immediately. Instead, he listened. There it was again, faint, irregular. Above, not directly over him this time, further back, near corridor B. He reached for the controls and pulled up the camera again. Same angle, same shadow, except it wasn't as consistent anymore. The thickness near the ceiling line had shifted slightly. Not enough to register as movement, but enough that it didn't match the earlier frame. Marcus leaned in, watched. Nothing changed. He switched feeds, then back. Now it looked thinner. He paused, waited. The rain above adjusted again, pressing harder across one section of the roof, then easing. In that brief fluctuation, the shadow expanded, then settled. Marcus didn't react immediately. He just sat there, processing. If it was lighting, it shouldn't behave like that. If it was structure, it shouldn't be that localized. And if it was nothing, it shouldn't repeat. He stood up again, not quickly, not urgently, just continuing the same routine, with a slight adjustment. This time, he didn't go straight to Corridor B. He took the longer route, circled through the waiting area. Rows of empty seats stretched out under dim light. Reflections pooled beneath them, slightly distorted by the angle of the floor. As he passed, one of the metal armrests gave a faint, delayed click. Marcus stopped. His breathing didn't stop, but it lost its rhythm. Turned. The seat remained still. He stepped closer. Nothing moved, but the sound had come a fraction too late, like it had followed him instead of reacting to him. He stayed there a moment, then continued on. By the time he reached Corridor B again, the rain had eased into a thinner pattern, lighter, more spaced out. That made everything else clearer. Too clear. The lowered ceiling pressed in again. Marcus stepped beneath it, and this time, he heard it without needing the rain to shift. A slow repositioning, not across distance, just within place, like something adjusting its weight carefully. Directly above him, Marcus exhaled through his nose. His grip tightened without him noticing. His fingers stayed tense longer than they should have. Steady. He didn't look up. His shoulders stayed still longer than they needed to. Instead, he took one step forward. The sound followed, not instantly, but close enough. He stopped. It stopped. A pause settled between both positions. Then, he stepped again. This time, the delay shortened. The sound above adjusted faster, not matching him exactly, but responding. Marcus felt it then. Not fear, recognition, a pattern forming. He moved forward without breaking pace, out from under the lowered ceiling, into the wider section of the corridor. The pressure lifted slightly. The sound didn't follow immediately. Instead, it stayed behind, holding position. Marcus turned at the far end, looked back. Nothing visible, just the corridor, the lights, the same stretched reflections, and that section of ceiling that now felt occupied. The space above wasn't empty. He walked back again, not directly, angled slightly, testing. When he stepped under the lowered section, nothing happened. He took another step, still nothing. Then, just before exiting the space, the sound came again, late, but placed. It didn't feel random anymore. It felt like something choosing where to be. Marcus stopped at the edge, waited. The sound above didn't move again. It stayed where it had last adjusted, not tracking him now, just remaining. He returned to the maintenance panel. This time, he didn't hesitate. He placed his hand against it again, pressed slightly harder. The surface gave just enough to confirm something behind it wasn't sitting evenly, not open, but not fully fixed either. Marcus leaned closer, listening. The rain thinned further, and for a moment, he could hear something else. Not movement, not breathing, just a presence of space being used, occupied in a way that didn't produce clear sound. He stepped back, slowly. His mind moved through explanations. Maintenance shift earlier, loose fittings, temperature changes, all of them possible, none of them precise enough. Behind him, something changed. Not above, not ahead, somewhere deeper in the terminal. A soft shift, like a door settling. Marcus turned, listened. Silence followed. Then the rain returned to a steady pattern. When he looked back at the panel, it looked exactly the same. Closed, aligned, still. But the certainty of that had weakened. Marcus took one final step back, just enough to create distance. And in that distance, a thought settled clearly. Not sudden, not sharp, just complete. Whatever was using the space above was no longer just part of the building. The rain continued. The lights held steady. The terminal remained unchanged. But the routine had shifted. Marcus didn't return to the office this time. He stayed in the open area between the corridors, just outside the lowered ceiling zone, where the space widened and the lights felt less compressed. From there, he could see both directions without stepping fully back into either. It felt like a better position. Not safer, just clearer. The rain continued above, but it had lost its earlier consistency. Now it came in uneven stretches, short bursts, followed by thin gaps that made the building sound hollow for a second at a time. Marcus waded through one of those gaps. Nothing came through. Then the rain returned. And with it, a faint adjustment above the corridor again, further back this time, not directly aligned with where he stood. He didn't move. Instead, he listened for a pattern. The sound didn't repeat immediately. It sat there, unresolved, like something deciding whether to continue. Marcus shifted his weight slightly. Not a step, just enough movement to test the space. The response came not from above him, but from the opposite side of the corridor. A small, deliberate repositioning, as if whatever occupied the upper space had adjusted toward a different point of reference. Marcus stayed still after that. For a second, he thought the sound came from directly behind him. Then continue normal flow, no panic. The realization came quietly. It wasn't following him anymore. It was anticipating, which meant it wasn't reacting anymore, which meant it was already ahead of him, which meant it had already learned his movement. He turned his head slightly toward the office behind him. The monitors would still be running, the cameras still active. For a moment, the thought of checking them again felt useful, but something held him in place. If the pattern had shifted, the cameras might not show it clearly anymore. Or worse, they might show something that didn't match what he was hearing. Marcus remained where he was, listening. The rain thinned again, and in that thinness, there was a second layer. Not a sound exactly, more like a break in expectation. The kind that happens when a familiar pattern drops one element. Marcus narrowed his focus, tried to isolate it. Then, he heard it. A short, controlled movement, not dragging, not shifting across distance, just a precise adjustment. Above the maintenance panel, Marcus didn't approach immediately. Instead, he took a step sideways. Out of direct alignment, the sound didn't follow. It stayed fixed. That confirmed it. Position mattered, not just movement. He walked slowly toward the panel again. This time, each step felt measured against something unseen. Halfway there, the rain stopped completely. Not gradually, just gone. For a few seconds, the entire building held a stillness that felt too clean. Marcus stopped mid-step, and in that silence, the sound above moved clearly for the first time. A careful repositioning, longer than before, not loud, but undeniable. It shifted from one point to another, directly above the panel. Then, it stopped. The rain returned, soft at first, then steady, as if nothing had happened. Marcus exhaled slowly. The absence had revealed more than the sound ever did. He reached the panel again, closer this time, close enough that he could see the fine line along its edge. It wasn't perfectly flush. It never had been. But now, there was a slight inconsistency along the top corner, barely visible, but present. Marcus raised his hand, paused, then pressed. The panel didn't open, but something behind it shifted. Not away, not deeper, just adjusted, in place. Marcus pulled his hand back immediately, not in panic, just recognition. That wasn't structural, that was reactive. He stepped back, one step, then another. The space between him and the panel widened again. The rain filled in the sound above, muted it, but not completely. Now that he knew where to listen, he could still catch fragments of it. Small, careful, deliberate. Marcus turned away, not fully, just enough to break direct focus. He began walking back toward the office, not because he wanted to leave, but because he needed a different angle, a different reference point. As he moved, the sound above did not follow. It stayed near the panel, holding position. Inside the office, the monitors flickered again as he stepped in. This time, he went straight to them. Pulled up corridor B. The image loaded. Everything looked the same. The ceiling, the lights, the panel. Marcus leaned closer. The shadow near the ceiling line. It wasn't thicker anymore. It was broken, not split, not moving, just interrupted, as if something within that space had altered how the light settled there. He watched for several seconds. Nothing shifted. He switched feeds, then back again. The interruption remained. Marcus sat down slowly, not taking his eyes off the screen. The pattern was clearer now, not in the visuals, but in the behavior. Above the panel, above the lowered ceiling, the space wasn't empty. It hadn't been for a while. The space above wasn't empty, and it wasn't random. Behind him, from somewhere in the corridor, there was a sound. Soft, delayed, like a step placed slightly after it should have been. Marcus didn't turn immediately. He kept his eyes on the monitor, waited. The sound didn't repeat. The rain continued. Then, on the screen, something changed. Not the panel, not the lights. The shadow line near the ceiling shifted slightly, not expanding, not shrinking, just repositioning, as if whatever occupied that space had moved to a new point above the corridor. Marcus stood up slowly. This time, the office didn't feel like a vantage point anymore. It felt delayed, like it was showing him something just after it had already happened elsewhere. He stepped out into the corridor again. The rain pressed harder against the roof. The sound returned to its layered state. But now, he could hear through it. Not clearly, but enough. Above him, there was movement again, closer than before. Not over the panel, not over the lowered ceiling, somewhere in between. Marcus stopped. His movement slowed before he decided to stop. Listened, and for the first time, the space above didn't feel like it was waiting. It felt like it had already adjusted to where he was going next. Marcus didn't move right away. The corridor stretched ahead of him in the same quiet way it always had, but the sense of direction had changed. It no longer felt like he was walking through a space. It felt like the space had already arranged itself around where he would be next. He adjusted his stance slightly. Not forward, not back. Just enough to shift his position by a few inches. Above him, nothing followed, but something held, like a pause that wasn't empty. The rain softened again, not fully stopping this time, but thinning enough to expose the structure beneath it. Marcus took a step, slow, measured, and just before his foot settled, there was a sound above, placed, not matching his movement, not reacting to it, just arriving slightly before it. Marcus stopped mid-step, lowered his foot the rest of the way. The delay between action and response had inverted. He didn't test it again immediately. Instead, he stood still and let the pattern sit. Rain, silence, then a faint repositioning above, not aligned with him, not trailing, just existing in a space that seemed to be shifting ahead of his movement rather than behind it. Marcus turned his head slightly toward the lowered ceiling. That section again. It looked unchanged, but now it felt prepared, like it was waiting for him to pass through it again. He didn't go there yet. Instead, he stepped toward the maintenance panel. The same panel, the same edge, the same slight imperfection along the corner. This time, he didn't reach for it. He just stood close enough to feel the air near it. There was a faint difference. Not colder, not warmer, just displaced, as if the space behind it held a volume that didn't match the rest of the building. Above, a soft adjustment, direct, immediate, not hidden by rain this time. Marcus didn't react. He let it happen, let it confirm itself. Then he stepped away. As he moved back into the wider corridor, something subtle shifted again. Not the sound, not the light, the timing. The building no longer felt delayed. It felt aligned, too aligned. Marcus walked toward the lowered ceiling once more. Not cautiously, not quickly, just continuing, the same way he had earlier. Routine. He stepped beneath it. This time, no sound followed, no adjustment. Nothing above responded. The absence felt deliberate. Marcus took another step. Still nothing. A third. Silence held. Then, as he reached the far edge of the lowered section, the sound came. Not behind him, not above where he had been, but ahead. Further down the corridor, placed where he was about to go. Marcus stopped at the edge, looked forward. The corridor remained empty, still, unchanged. But the space above it was not. He didn't continue. Instead, he stepped back. One step, then another, returning to the center of the open area, the wider space, where the building felt less directed. Above him, the sound did not follow. It stayed ahead. Holding position, Marcus turned slowly in place, taking in the full layout. Corridor B, the panel, the lowered ceiling, the office behind him. Each section now carried a different weight, not visually, but structurally, as if the building had divided itself into zones of attention. The rain began to fade, gradually this time, softening into a distant pattern, then thinning further, until only occasional drops touched the roof. With the rain gone, the space revealed itself completely, and in that quiet, Marcus heard it. Not movement, not adjustment, presence, distributed, not fixed to one point anymore, not contained above the panel, not limited to the lowered ceiling, spread. Across the upper structure, he didn't look up. There was no point now. The exact position didn't matter. Only the pattern. Marcus walked back toward the office, not quickly, not hesitating, just continuing, as if returning to routine could still anchor something. Inside, the monitors glowed the same way they always had. He looked at them. Corridor B, empty. The panel, closed. The ceiling, still. But the shadow line, it no longer showed interruption. It showed consistency, a uniform density across the entire upper section, as if whatever had shifted had settled. Marcus sat down, placed his keys on the desk again. The sound they made felt smaller this time, less defined. Behind him, no footsteps, no movement, just the space, holding. He leaned back slightly, listened. Nothing distinct came through. No clear signals, no isolated sounds. Only the quiet awareness that the building was no longer divided into empty and occupied. It was simply used. After a while, Marcus stood up again. Not to check, not to confirm, just to move. He walked to the edge of the office doorway and stopped there, looked out across the terminal. Nothing seemed out of place. Routine, structure, order. And somewhere above, not directly over him, not directly anywhere, the space held steady. He wasn't sure if it had moved closer or if he had been standing in the wrong place the entire time. No longer adjusting, no longer reacting, just remaining. Marcus didn't reach for the panel again, didn't walk back under the lowered ceiling, didn't check the doors. The latch he had checked earlier, he didn't think about it anymore. Whether it was closed or slightly open, the rain had stopped completely now. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was settled. Marcus turned off one of the monitors, then another, leaving only a single screen active, a partial view, not the full layout. Enough to see, not enough to understand. He sat back down, and for the first time that night, he didn't listen for anything specific. He let the space remain exactly as it was, and whatever occupied it didn't need to move anymore. Story number 4. At exactly 3 a.m., my security system detected movement inside a hallway that was completely sealed. I checked every door. Every lock was still in place. But something had already moved through the house. A low, steady hum had been sitting in the walls for a while, something I'd tuned out hours ago, blending with the soft tapping of rain against the glass. It wasn't loud or sharp, just constant, like the house was holding its breath in a way I hadn't questioned until the notification cut through it. It came in at exactly 3 a.m., a quiet vibration on the nightstand, followed by a short chime that felt out of place in the stillness. For a second, I didn't move. The rain kept its slow rhythm, and the hum didn't change, but something about the timing made it feel deliberate, like the house had waited for that exact moment to say something. The system didn't trigger twice, just once. Like whatever it detected didn't need to be detected again. I reached for my phone without turning on the light. The screen brightness felt colder than usual, washing everything in a pale tone that made the room look flatter than it should have. The notification sat there. Simple and neutral motion detected, interior hallway, but it didn't match anything I could hear or feel around me. I remember pausing before opening it, trying to match the alert with something real. A branch against the siding, maybe. A shift in the wind. But the rain hadn't picked up, and the forest outside had that same muted presence it always had at night, like it absorbed anything that tried to move through it. Even the usual creaks in the structure felt absent. When I opened the feed, the hallway appeared exactly as I expected it to. Narrow, still. The door at the end shut the way I'd left it, and the walls catching just enough of the night vision glow to outline their shape. Nothing moved at first. The system timestamp blinked quietly in the corner, steady, precise. Then something crossed the frame, but not from the edge. It was already there. It wasn't fast. That's what made it harder to process. It moved with a kind of consistency that felt intentional, not like a glitch or a flicker. A shape just dense enough to interrupt the light, passed along the floor and rose slightly as it reached the midpoint of the hallway, as if it understood the space it was moving through. I sat up without realizing it, the phone a little closer to my face. The hum in the walls seemed to deepen, or maybe I just started noticing it more. The rain didn't change, but it felt farther away now, like it was happening somewhere else entirely. The shape didn't trigger anything else, no second alert, no change in the system status. It moved from one side of the frame to the other and then nothing. The hallway returned to the same still image, as if it had reset itself. I watched the clip again. The second time, I focused on the edges. The way the figure, if that's what it was, interacted with the baseboards. The slight shift as it passed near the small table against the wall. It didn't blur over anything. It moved behind it. Not like a shadow. Like it understood where the object existed. Not over. Not through. Behind. That didn't make sense. And for a second, I felt like I wasn't supposed to notice it. I lowered the phone just enough to look at my door. It was still closed. I could see the faint outline of the frame in the dim light, exactly where it should be. The lock hadn't been touched. I knew that without checking, the same way you know when something hasn't been moved in a room you've memorized. For a moment, I considered getting up, walking out, checking the hallway myself. But the thought didn't fully settle. It hovered there, incomplete, like something that didn't belong to me. Instead, I played the clip again. This time, I noticed the timing. Not the movement, but the moment it began. It didn't enter the frame from the edge. It was already there, just outside what the camera could fully register, and then it adjusted, sliding into view as if it had been waiting for the system to recognize it. I wasn't sure why that detail mattered, but it stayed with me longer than anything else. The hum continued, steady, unchanged. The rain followed its same pattern against the glass. Nothing in the physical space around me had shifted, and yet, something had moved through the hallway in a way that felt measured, like it knew exactly where it could be seen. I didn't realize how long I'd been sitting there until the screen dimmed on its own. The room around me hadn't changed, but my sense of it had. The corners felt flatter, like depth had been reduced to something visual instead of physical. I tapped the screen again, bringing the hallway back, needing to see if it would look different after a pause. It didn't. Same angle, same stillness, same faint glow outlining the walls and the door at the end. If anything, it looked more ordinary now, like the clip I'd just watched had already started slipping into something explainable. I almost believed it for a second. I opened the archive, The system stored everything in clean segments, each one labeled with time, duration, and trigger type. The 3 a.m. clip sat at the top, untouched. Beneath it, there were older recordings, most of them empty, just the hallway existing in quiet intervals. I selected the one directly before it, 2:57 a.m. Nothing moved. The frame held steady, the same quiet geometry of the space, the same flat tone from the night vision. I let it play longer than I needed to, watching for any subtle shift that might explain what came after. There wasn't one. The hallway stayed exactly as it should. I went back to 3. This time, I slowed it down. Frame by frame, the movement lost its smoothness and became something else. The shape didn't emerge the way a person would. There was no entry point, no gradual reveal. It occupied space in fragments, each frame adjusting its position slightly, like it wasn't moving through the hallway so much as being placed within it. I leaned closer, not out of fear, but because something about the spacing felt off. When it reached the small table along the wall, the inconsistency became clearer. The edge of the shadow dipped behind the table leg before the rest of it aligned. For a brief moment, the geometry didn't match. It corrected itself in the next frame, but the mismatch lingered just long enough to feel real. I replayed that section again. The second time, it felt like it moved slightly earlier. The same thing happened. A slight delay between where it should be and where it actually was, as if the space had to adjust around it. Not much, just enough to make it hard to categorize. I paused the video and looked up. The silence in the house felt heavier now, not louder, just more defined. The hum in the walls hadn't changed, but it seemed more noticeable in the gaps between my own movements. Even the rain felt distant, like it had shifted behind something I couldn't see. I stood up slowly, more out of habit than decision, and moved toward the door. My hand hovered near the handle for a second, waiting for some kind of confirmation from the space around me. There wasn't any. Everything remained still, consistent, unbothered. When I opened it, the hallway outside my room matched the screen exactly. Same length, same table, same closed door at the end. Nothing moved. I stayed there longer than I meant to, just looking, trying to overlay what I'd seen on the phone with what was in front of me. It didn't align. The physical space felt complete, uninterrupted, like it had no awareness of anything passing through it. I stepped back and closed the door. For a moment, I considered calling someone, not because I thought I was in danger, but because I needed a second perspective, something to confirm that what I was seeing wasn't just a misread of light or timing. Jack would be awake. He usually was around this hour. I didn't call. Instead, I went back to the footage. This time, I noticed something I hadn't before. Not in the movement itself, but in the absence around it. The shape cast no distortion on the surrounding light. It interrupted it, yes, but it didn't carry any of it with it. No gradient, no edge softening, nothing that suggested a source. Just a presence defined by what it wasn't. I scrubbed back to the beginning again, slower now, and for the first time, I realized something that didn't fit anywhere. At the exact moment the system marked motion detection before the shape fully entered the frame, the timestamp flickered. Just once, a fraction of a second. Small enough to ignore if you weren't looking for it. But now that I'd seen it, I couldn't unsee it. It didn't skip forward or backward. It just hesitated. Like the system itself wasn't sure when the movement had actually started. I sat there with that detail longer than anything else, because it meant the camera didn't catch the moment the hallway changed. It only caught the moment it noticed. I didn't try to sleep after that. The idea felt misplaced, like it belonged to a version of the night that had already passed. Instead, I stayed where I was, the phone in my hand, letting the footage loop in shorter and shorter segments until the movement felt less like an event and more like a pattern I hadn't fully understood yet. Around 3:20, I finally opened a call with Jack. He picked up after 2 rings, his voice low, steady, like I'd pulled him out of something quiet rather than sleep. I didn't explain everything at once. I just told him what the system had flagged, kept it simple, and asked him to stay on the line while I replayed the clip. There was a pause while he watched. Then he said it didn't look like anything. For a second, I almost wanted him to be right. Because if nothing was there, then I didn't know why I kept seeing it. Not dismissive, just certain in a way that made it harder to argue with. I didn't respond right away. I watched the same section again while he stayed quiet on the other end. The shape crossed the hallway the same way, with the same slight misalignment near the table, the same measured pacing that didn't feel random. "Do you see where it dips?" I asked, keeping my voice low without meaning to. Another pause. "No," he said. "I see a shadow, maybe. But it's probably compression. Low light, movement. The system tries to fill in what it thinks is there." His explanation made sense in a way that felt complete, clean, something I could accept and move on from if I wanted to. I played it again. The dip was still there. "It goes behind the table," I said. "Not over it, behind." "That's just how it's rendering depth," he replied. "You're looking too closely." Maybe I was. I didn't argue after that. I let the call sit between us for a while, the sound of his breathing faint through the speaker, the rain still tapping at the glass in the same steady pattern. The hum in the walls hadn't shifted. Nothing in the physical space around me had changed. "Check the logs," he added after a minute. "See if anything else triggered around that time." I had already looked, but I did it again anyway. Nothing new. No additional motion. No door sensors. No window alerts. The system recorded the event as a single, isolated occurrence, cleanly contained within its own timestamp. "That's good," he said. "Means it's probably just a one-off. Probably." I ended the call without saying much else. For a while, I just sat there again. The footage paused on the frame where the shape reached the center of the hallway. The longer I looked at it, the less it felt like something that had moved, and more like something that had briefly aligned with the space. That thought didn't come from anywhere specific. It just settled in. I opened another clip from earlier in the night, not because I expected to find anything, but because I wanted to confirm the consistency. The hallway appeared the same as always, still, empty, unchanged. I let it play for a few seconds, then skipped ahead. Nothing. I moved to another timestamp. Still, nothing. It was only when I returned to the 3 clip again that something shifted, not in the footage, but in how I was reading it. The shape didn't just move differently. It followed a path that didn't match anything I'd ever done in that space. I knew that hallway well enough to predict how someone would cross it. You step out, you move along the wall or down the center, you adjust slightly near the table without thinking about it. There's a natural rhythm to it. This didn't follow that. It drifted closer to the wall than necessary, then corrected in a way that didn't align with the layout. The adjustment wasn't for the space. It was like it was correcting for something else. I replayed it again, slower, and for a brief moment, the shape seemed to hesitate not physically, but in its position relative to the frame, as if it had anticipated a different boundary than the one it encountered. I leaned back, the phone resting loosely in my hand. The idea formed slowly, without urgency. What if the camera wasn't recording the hallway the way I experienced it? Not incorrectly, just differently. The forest outside came to mind then, not visually, but as a presence. The way sound dropped off near the house. The way the darkness held its shape without reflecting anything back. It wasn't something I had questioned before. It was just part of the environment. But now, it felt connected in a way I couldn't fully explain, not as a cause, more like a condition. I glanced toward the window, though I couldn't see much beyond the glass. The rain continued its quiet pattern, uninterrupted. The darkness beyond it remained flat, absorbing everything without returning detail. I looked back at the screen, and for a second, I wasn't sure which version of the space I was looking at. I didn't play the clip again right away. Instead, I let the frame sit there, frozen at the point where the shape reached the center of the hallway, as if holding it still might reveal something the movement had hidden. The longer I looked, the less it felt like a moment captured in time and more like a position that had briefly overlapped with the space. Around 3:40, Another notification came through. Not motion, just a system check. Routine, automatic, something the network did every so often without meaning anything. But the timing felt close enough to matter. I opened it anyway, more out of habit than expectation, and let the interface pull me into the live feed. The hallway appeared again, unchanged. No movement, no distortion, just the same, still geometry under the night vision glow. I watched longer this time, waiting for something to repeat. It didn't. The frame held steady in a way that felt almost deliberate, like it was maintaining a version of itself that didn't allow for variation. After a while, I tapped back into the recorded clip. The transition between live and recorded felt subtle, but not identical. The recorded version had a kind of flatness to it that the live feed didn't fully share, not a loss of quality exactly, more like a difference in how the space was being interpreted. I hadn't noticed that before. I switched back to live, then back again. The hallway remained the same in both, but the sense of it didn't. In the recording, the edges felt more certain, more defined, as if the system had already decided what belonged there. In the live feed, there was a slight softness, something unresolved in the way the light settled along the walls. I stayed with that for a while, moving between the two views, letting the difference settle instead of trying to explain it. At some point, I realized I was holding my breath without meaning to. I let it out slowly and set the phone down beside me. The hum in the walls continued, steady and unchanged. The rain kept its quiet rhythm against the glass. Nothing in the room had shifted. And yet, something about the space felt slightly misaligned, like I was no longer fully synced with it. I stood up again, slower this time, and walked to the door. When I opened it, the hallway outside looked exactly the same as it had before. No movement, no sign of anything passing through. The table stood where it always did, the door at the end closed, the walls catching just enough light to define their shape. I stepped into the hallway. The air felt cooler than I expected, though I couldn't say why. Not cold enough to matter, just different enough to notice. I moved a few steps forward, stopping near the table, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness without relying on the screen. Nothing moved. I turned slightly, trying to match the angle I'd seen in the recording. For a moment, everything aligned. Then it didn't. It was subtle, easy to miss if I hadn't been looking for it. The position of the table relative to the wall felt just slightly off, not physically, but perceptually, like the space between them had shifted by an amount too small to measure. I blinked, and it returned to normal. I didn't move after that. I just stood there, letting the stillness settle around me, waiting for something to confirm what I'd felt. It didn't. The hallway remained quiet, unchanged, consistent in every way that mattered. Eventually, I stepped back into my room and closed the door. The lock clicked into place with the same soft sound it always made. I leaned against it for a second, listening not for movement but for any change in the pattern of the house itself. There wasn't one. I picked up the phone again and opened the live feed. The hallway appeared, steady and still. For a moment, I just watched it without thinking, letting the image exist without trying to interpret it. The longer I looked, the easier it became to accept that what I'd seen earlier might not repeat, that it could remain contained within that single clip. Then, without warning, the timestamp hesitated again. If you watch it long enough, you'll see it too, just once, a fraction of a second. And in that hesitation, something adjusted, not a full shape, not a clear movement, just a slight shift along the edge of the frame, as if something had briefly aligned with the camera's understanding of the space. I didn't move. I didn't zoom in. I just watched. Because whatever it was, it didn't appear in the hallway itself. Only in the version of it the system chose to show me. And I couldn't tell if that meant it wasn't there, or if I just wasn't able to see it.